With the recent release of Jujutsu Kaisen Execution and the upcoming Season 3 release, fans are excited for the Culling Games, but most of all, Realman Sukuna versus Satoru Gojo, the strongest sorcerer in history versus the strongest sorcerer of the modern era, the Fallen One versus the Honored One, a dual hype from the manga's third chapter. Many fans have crowned this as the best fight in modern shonen, but I believe they are wrong. This fight certainly has hype, spectacle, and a great choreography, yet it misses the most crucial aspect of all fights. It misses the narrative substance, it misses a deeper message, a thematic resonance, a soul. There is a theme within this fight that Gege Akutami is trying to tell, such as the lonely, loved victor versus the lonely, unloved loser. It's a profound idea, but completely fraudulent on the narrative scale, because nowhere in the 236 chapters before the conclusion of this fight are we ever shown that Gojo is lonely, or why he's lonely, or are we ever given to believe that Sukuna's existence is defined by lack of love. If these ideas are shown, they are not developed in the slightest way. The emotional center of this battle is non-existent, making the fight feel hollow. This isn't an isolated flaw of the fight itself, it's a symptom of Gege's greatest weakness, his inability to provide meaningful and long-term characterization. He can only provide end-of-life characterization, which is not good character execution. He does realize that characters need depth, but he consistently provides it only in their final moments, such as characters with Toji, Gojo, and Sukuna. Although in this fight, Gege completely assassinates Gojo's character, but that's besides the point. What Gege does is a cheap imitation of development, where Gege Akutami focuses on the body of the character rather than their soul. So this is not a case of a good fight with a bad ending. This is a case of a decent fight within a mediocre story. This is a case study in squandered potential where breathtaking animation and clever powers are used to wallpaper over a story with no emotional foundation. So this video is a case for why, despite all its hype, Gojo vs. Sukuna is the biggest disappointment in modern shonen. This video is not a direct response to Orion's The Best Fight in Modern Shonen video, although I will link the video in that description as it is helpful for some context. But no, this video is a bigger response to the Jujutsu Kaisen community at large. This will not serve as a series review. I would lose my mind pointing out all the issues in this manga. It is simply meant to be a serious examination of why the Gojo vs. Sukuna fight fails. I will be direct in my analysis and will not hold back, as I believe this series has been hyped to an unrealistic level, and my goal is to bring us down to reality. You can still like something that is garbage. We just have to make sure we remain objective when talking about it. Before we dissect the fight itself, I need to establish the scope and the core of my critique. This video will focus on chapters 212 to chapters 238, starting with Sukuna's possession of Megumi Fushiguro, Sukuna vs. Yorozu, the sealing of Gojo, the unsealing of Gojo, and the Gojo vs. Sukuna battle itself. This is a good block to build a bigger picture of why this fight sucks, as the issues present are not isolated. Again, they are symptoms of a narrative disease that infected the series long before this clash. My central argument is that the fight, like many others in the series, lacks a soul. What do I mean by a soul? A great shonen fight is more than a spectacle of might. It is a collision of will, philosophy, and deeply personal stakes. It needs a core beyond choreography, something that makes the audience care about who wins or loses on a human level. The hype must be earned by the narrative, not just the animation budget or idiots on Twitter. And that's what makes this series, or this fight, the failure of it, so bitter. The early showings of this series showed a lot of immense promise, precisely because it understood that it needed narrative, it needed weight. Presented a compelling blend of Bleach and Naruto with a modern twist, offering flashes of character development and profound substance. such as Megami's Save People Unequally ethos, or Yuji's mission to give good deaths from his grandfather's will, or Gojo and his desire to reform a broken system. It really had the blueprint to join the great manga. But instead of building on that character development or on that character-driven foundation, Gege chose to emphasize only the cool fights and a convoluted power system, while also adding more side characters who do nothing, while abandoning the previously introduced characters and dropping any compelling subplot, or character arc established in the beginning. The potential for the deep world building and relationships were traded for the next flashy curse technique. After Shibuya, and arguably before then, and let's say the cursed womb arc, the narrative became a hollow engine for spectacle. And the Gojo vs. Sukuna fight is the ultimate expression. It has monumental plot stakes, but its emotional and thematic stakes are so minuscule. With that in mind, let's move on to the meat of the argument. We're going to examine how this lack of soul manifests, starting with the fatal flaws in the fight setup itself. Chapter 2 of the manga, this is the first time Sukuna and Gojo meet, where Gojo embarrasses Sukuna after Sukuna reincarnates in Yuji and destroys the cursed spirit that was giving Yuji and Megami a difficult time. I will say the manga or the anime does a better job of showcasing how dominant Gojo is, but that's besides the point. This interaction perfectly shows the strength hierarchy early on. The first 3 chapters do a wonderful job of establishing the world and loosely establishing characters, where you focus on Gojo and Sukuna, the 2 strongest. But at this point, we don't really know that much about them, but Gege does establish the base conflict between them. For Gojo, Gege establishes 2 key traits. A. He cares for his students, listening to Megami's request to find a way for Yuji to live despite killing him being the easier and smarter option. And B. Gojo is philosophically aligned with saving people. After speaking to Yuji, and Yuji asking, if Sukuna is completely annihilated or eliminated, will there be fewer curses or fewer people killed by curses? Gojo looks at Yuji, smiles and says, of course. This immediately established a potential contrast to Sukuna, who upon reincarnating again, seeks only to slaughter, declaring it will be a massacre. Focus and move onward to the allusion to the fight itself. You have Sukuna personally challenge Gojo in chapter 3, where Sukuna says, when I make this kid's body mine, it'll be the first I kill. Again, the foundation is very solid. Gege has established the core dynamic between Gojo and Sukuna. He has established that Gojo is the strongest sorcerer who uses his strength for others and saving others, while Sukuna is the strongest curse, the king of curses, who uses his strength for himself and hedonistic violence. The blueprint for a profound ideological clash is clearly established. Hopefully, Gege and Katami will continue to flesh out this dynamic so when their inevitable battle occurs, there will be a reason to care about who won rather than how they won. The reader can hopefully connect with the characters and want one to win besides just liking the character's strength. The next time these 2 characters interact is chapter 221. That is 218 chapters before the conflict is brought back up. I have seen arguments where people say that the antagonist and the protagonist should not have to talk before they fight, which I can't agree depending on the situation, but great fights do have build-up that is consistent. If Gege just simply added more moments between Gojo and Sukuna or had more characterization for Gojo and Sukuna, then I would not have a personal issue with this. But he doesn't, so it falls flat. Now it's time to move on to something more controversial, and that is Sukuna's character. We have a gap between chapter 3 and chapter 221. In this time, Gojo is slightly fleshed out, with Gege having the hidden inventory arc, where we have Riko, Gojo, Geto, the Star Plasma Vessel, and also Toji as well. So there is something there. But do we get anything for Sukuna? No, we do not. Sukuna remains a mystery, which is fine, but if he's supposed to fight a character with history, we need to be able to care about Sukuna in this fight. Again, we know that he's evil and very hedonistic, where hedonistic is simply an adjective that means engaged in a pursuit of pleasure. He's very self-indulgent. but his philosophy remains a complete mystery. The why behind his evil is simply ignored. He's cool and he's strong, but there's nothing else about him. And that's the worst part about Sukuna's character. Again, his history, his views on strength and love, it's revealed right after he kills Gojo. It made a lot more sense if Sukuna's character, meant to be a mirror of Gojo's, was revealed before. Even when Sukuna dies at the end of the manga, or he gives up or whatever, it's the same thing with Toji, where you have a end of life or post-mortem characterization. Gege withholds crucial depth until the moment it can no longer impact our emotional engagement with the conflict. It doesn't even add a recontextualization of the character, it just makes the character look stupid. Some individuals would argue and say that letting villains be evil is fine and they don't need to have a bunch of depth, which I slightly agree with, but the execution still needs to be important. Villains can be evil, and they should be evil. They don't have to have a tragic reason or be super complex, but they still need a why. And however, this argument wouldn't apply if Sukuna was only one-dimensional. The problem is he's not one-dimensional. The problem is he's not a force of nature. He's a human being who was born a human and became a curse. So why does he want to become a curse? Or why did he become a curse? We have no idea. It's the same way that we have Sukuna wants to kill Gojo because Gojo embarrassed him, which is understandable, but why did this embarrassment affect Sukuna so deeply? Why is Sukuna so prideful? I got no idea. Furthermore, why Sukuna call it the Fallen One, as stated in chapter 199 or chapter 200, where Angel and Hana call him the Fallen One? I have no idea. But again, are you starting to see the pattern with this character? It gets even more annoying in chapter 238. Again, this is after Sukuna has killed Gojo. Hashimo Hajime, which is another character that's wasted potential, he asks Sukuna, he says, Sukuna, did you earn the title of the strongest, or were you simply born as such? Sukuna responds with, who knows? I was born a cursed, unwanted little wrench. That much I can say. This actually corresponds to the theme in which Gege is trying to show of being a unloved destroyer who's lonely versus a loved and lonely savior. But it's so annoying, again, that this was not put into the story before the fight itself happened. It's even more weird because Gege tries to use the are you the strongest because you're Gojo Satoru, or are you Gojo Satoru because you are the strongest from Geto, but it fails here because we don't have any history between Kashimo and Sukuna. There's history between Geto and Gojo, and Geto asking that makes sense because Geto actually knows Gojo. Kashimo does not know Sukuna. It's just stupid. It's an absolute waste of a profound and compelling idea because there is no build up to it. It's stupid. But that's enough for Sukuna for now. He is a terrible character, but it's time to move on to Gojo because Gege fails Gojo in this setup as well. With Gojo in this fight, I already talked about the hidden inventory arc and how Gojo was established and his backstory with the Geto was fleshed out. But besides that, Gojo is ruined by inconsistencies and poor characterization. It seems like Gege Akutami forgot how to write him, but let me explain. The base setup for Gojo doing this fight anyway is that he gets unsealed. The first thing he does is go find Kenjaku to kill Kenjaku because he's using Geto's body. However, Sukuna stops Gojo from killing Kenjaku, and so Gojo's like, oh wait, they must have a binding vow. I'm just gonna fight Sukuna, then kill Kenjaku. But there's something else missing from this. There's something very important. There's someone very important to the story, and that person is Megumi Fushiguro. Gojo acknowledges that Sukuna has taken Megumi's body, but he doesn't seem to care. He just mocks Sukuna. Again, this is so bizarre and so weird, considering this character is supposed to care about Megumi. From the hidden inventory arc, we know that Gojo has watched over Megami since he was a child. Why doesn't he care about Megami at all? I understand that Gojo isn't a character who would get emotional or vocalize his feelings for Megami as one of like a student mentor or even a father figure. But if they're having a close relationship, this scene or interaction does not show it. It's stupid. Even when he faces up against Sukuna near the start of chapter 221, all Gojo says is, I can totally wail on Megami. He thinks about Megami and says, I can worry about Megami after I kill Sukuna. This is really stupid. Like, this is really stupid. Again, even in the same panel, he says dying once as Yuji was a mistake. He knows that if the vessel dies, the curse dies as well. So if he kills Sukuna, Megami is dead. This was established in the first chapters of the manga. This is some of the dumbest character writing I've seen in a long time because the character is becoming so inconsistent. It's like you're morphing him into something he's not. Gege kind of realized that he made Gojo too likable, but there's something else I want to briefly talk about, and that's the Mega Fushiguro possession. I don't like it. I could speak on how Gege failed him as a character, but that video would take so long. All I will say that is Gege really dropped the ball on the whole possession subplot. Again, let me state the idea is good and interesting and has been foreshadowed for a very long time. But when Sukuna takes over Megami's body, all future subplots of Megami instantly die. Given the rules of reincarnation, the character of Megami Fushiguro is pretty much dead. That's what I thought. So it wasn't really an issue. And it wasn't even an issue that Sukuna could separate his soul and detach himself from his host. That was pretty obvious. Although the whole binding vow thing with Yuji that I won't talk about because it will make me even more mad. I'm not going to talk about it. It's just that Gege basically assassinated Megami's character at this point. Going off on a tangent, I originally thought that Sukuna would eat Maharaga, which would force Megami to actually have to use his 10 shadows instead of relying on his trump card, which would be a good consequence for the character who's consistently throwing his life away. Although I thought I learned that in chapter 58 when he fought the Finger Bearer and unlocked his domain, but whatever. Because we know that Sukuna needs Maharaga to get through Gojo's infinity, but this battle doesn't really become Sukuna versus Gojo, it becomes the 10 Shadows versus Gojo. It's just a missed opportunity. It's even worse because if Sukuna would have simply stolen Maharaga, then this would better characterize Sukuna for being someone who steals techniques, from being someone who is slimy, manipulative, he eats stuff. He is kind of like Yuji in a certain way, who eats cursed objects, which would also help the dichotomy, the juxtaposition between Yuji and Sukuna, that the story keeps trying to force but never goes anywhere. If Sukuna simply ate Maharaga and used him to kill Sumaki, which would be a way to taunt Megami, which would still force the character to grow. But speaking of Sumaki Fushiguro, I unfortunately have to talk about the Sukuna versus Yorozu fight because Gege uses thematic messages in this fight in the Gojo versus Sukuna fight, which I simply cannot stand and think it's absolutely atrocious. I'll try not to spend too long on this fight because we all know how awful it is. It's awful, but I do need to talk about it because there are some things that get used and carried onward to the Sukuna versus Gojo fight that will be a focus of mine. So Sumaki Fushiguro is the sister of Megami Fushiguro, although Sumaki is an awful character, while Yorozu is just as bad. Yorozu has a bad character introduction, she has bad character motives, and she also only serves as a plot device to give Sukuna the Kamotoki, which is a contrived object and appears out of nowhere. But the biggest sin of this fight is the love theme brought up by Yorozu. Again, Gege in the Gojo versus Sukuna fight is trying to do it's about love. It's about characters who are so strong, who are so isolated, supposedly, that they have very different definitions of love. Then this could work if it was built upon and established prior on the story. It just randomly gets dropped in. It makes no sense. I will state that it's an interesting topic to discuss, but but there is no build up, there is no indication, and there is no other arcs that touch this topic. Like other things in this chapter, in this manga, the idea is randomly thrown in to appear more intelligent and more profound than it truly is. It's a reoccurring thing in the manga. You introduce something interesting, you forget about said thing, you insert a allure of depth to said thing, then you remove said thing from the story. You can apply this to the characters, to the setting, to the plot points, whatever. It's awful. And furthermore, this whole fight does nothing to flesh out Sukuna. It is nothing. Again, this could have been a really good option to flesh out Sukuna and really explain to us why he is the way he was, but he doesn't, because Sukuna simply rejects everything and says, I already know about love. It's stupid. It's stupid. It gets weirder, especially in chapter 218, where we have Yorozu say, and I quote, I have much more to teach you about love and the ultimate strength and the solitude it brings. I'm the one who'll teach you about love. When I first read this part, I laughed out loud. It's extremely absurd, again, because where does it come from? There is nothing prior to this that shows that Sukuna thinks about love. And it's just dumb. It's even stupider because you don't even have any flashback, but like the flashback you have with Yorozu, Sukuna, and the Frost Girl, like Urame, whatever her name is, does nothing for the story. Again, this is a recurring theme. The ideas presented within this chapter are very interesting, but the execution is piss poor. But I'm moving on, because this video is starting to turn into a rant, and I haven't even discussed the fight itself. There is so much more I could talk about, but let's move on. Now I'm going to show why this fight sucks itself. The fight between Gojo and Sukuna is visually stunning itself, with well thought out choreography and display of previously established rules, for the most part. The best moments of this fight are simply when Gojo and Sukuna are fighting, and there is no dialogue or interjections by the other Jujutsu sorcerers. But that leads to an issue, or initial issue with this fight. It's the tone. The tone is all over the place, with funny quips from Gojo in chapter 224, to the students analyzing the fight in chapter 225, and then to internal thoughts from Gojo and Sukuna in later chapters. What's really annoying about this is that Gege tries to use previously established ideas, especially from chapter 221, and before in chapter 219 or 218 with Sukuna and Yorozu, to try to flesh out these characters, but it really doesn't mean anything because they're getting fleshed out during the fight. If you initially showed us these moments, these interactions, this could have been avoided, so the tone is more clear and concise. It's even worse when we have later flashbacks after Gojo is dead that do establish the character better and establish the stakes better. It's really annoying that Gege would choose to have these random flashbacks appear later on instead of during this era where, or during the time skip, the gap where Gojo and Sukuna are preparing for their fight. We move on to chapter 225, for instance, where there's a lot of dialogue and it's just really, really a big exposition dump and destroys the flow of the fight. It's also really annoying because at the end of chapter 225, after really long explanations, it cuts to Gojo and Sukuna opening their domains. I really wish we could have just had Gojo and Sukuna continue their fight, then go to the domain clash instead of cutting to exposition, then going back to the visuals. It's just really annoying. This also leads to another point about this fight itself, is that there's a lot of telling rather than showing, where characters will speak a lot, but the story cannot breathe, and because it's always trying to tell the audience what's happening, although instead of letting the reader see what's happening. It's odd because this manga does a decent job of blending visual storytelling with written storytelling, but in this instance, it really just shows that Gege can't write, or he got lazy, because he kind of realized something, which I'll talk about. The domain clash is very interesting and good, as there are no new rules made. It's obvious why Gojo's domain breaks. Again, this is established early on in chapter. I forgot what chapter it is, but it's the chapter where Gojo and Yuji are facing off against Jogo, and Gojo opens his domain to show what Yuji a domain is, and he makes the rules and explains it. And domains are weak from the outside, and Sukuna's domain goes outside the range of Gojo's, so it makes sense of why it happens. And it's fine. However, chapter 232, when things really start to break apart narratively, but also the fight itself. In this chapter, this is where Maharaga breaks through Gojo's domain and adapts. That's where Sukuna is using Megami's soul to adapt. However, during this fight, this moment, something really stupid happens. They're talking to each other, and Gojo says, I'm glad you're fighting so hard. And Sukuna says, not as hard as you. Don't know what to take of this statement, because it's pretty stupid, as Gege is telling us one thing, but doesn't correspond to what he's showing. This is the same person who literally had their domain open, or had domain clash like 4 times with Gojo, reversed their technique, who got hit in the chest by Gojo, and so forth, who was literally about to lose if Maharaga was not there. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it gets even stupider after Gojo and Sukuna have their nosebleed moments where their brains are basically fried. But when that happens, Gojo has a pretty cool line, and he, help me look cooler in front of my students, and he represented their fight. However, at the end of chapter 230, there's a moment where we have Gojo and Sukuna, and there's 2 panels where Gojo's like ultimate strength and the solitude it brings, and then Sukuna is thinking, I'm the one who'll teach you about love. This is, I'm assuming this is Sukuna's thoughts. I'm assuming. The issue is, I don't really know why the character is thinking about this in the first place, since he already knows what love is. It really seems like a random plot point that Gege wanted to do early on, but got so lazy and so fast-paced in the story that he didn't have time to put it. But this is still bad characterization, also bad writing, because we still don't know A, why Sukuna is called the Fallen One, and B, we don't know why, there's this dichotomy of a lonely person versus another lonely person, because we again have not seen Gojo be lonely at all. We haven't seen anything to indicate that, truly, so I don't understand where it's coming from. Furthermore, we have another bad characterization on chapter 231, where Gojo tells Sukuna that I don't need that much time to kill you, referring to Maharaga's adaptation. And then Angel responds saying, has he forgotten that's Megami body? This is really stupid, as I previously stated about earlier on when the fight first happened of Gojo not really caring about Megami. It just further highlights that point, because why is Gojo being so inconsistent? He could have been a really great character, but Gege simply had no idea what to do with this character, as he wanted Gojo to be like, Uehara from Bleach, but Gojo ends up being more like Kakashi, like a more involved Kakashi, like a Kakashi who was truly a main protagonist, although Kakashi does have great moments in Naruto. It seems like that, but he just doesn't realize that. And I don't think he didn't know what to do with him. Like, I know he wanted him to die, but it's just stupid. We move forward to chapter 233, where we randomly have this moment of Gojo thinking about Toji, about defeat. And I think it's interesting, but he has a random line where the narrator says, being the strongest sorcerer came with a sense of isolation. So the source of his present sense of fulfillment was, and it does something. Again, I asked the author of the community, where is the isolation plot point coming from? Where has he expressed isolation? Where have we seen signs of him being lonely? This is another example of Gege forcing character development or characterization at the end of the character's life. It's stupid. He did this with Toji. He did it with Sukuna, with Ninjaku, and Sukuna. Having a small slice of characterization at the end of the character's life doesn't make them a good characters. Good characters are characters with motivations, backstories, traits, and arcs, which help them get closer to their goal or move further away from it. Again, each arc a character is involved in should have them change or move toward that goal or do something. And that change can be good or bad, depending on what arc you want the character to take on, but needs to be consistent. You can't give the illusion of character development without actually doing it. You waste the reader's time. That's why characters in this manga are wide as oceans but deep as ponds, because they have nothing to it. But that's it for now. The rest of the chapter, the rest of the fight itself is actually pretty good. The Hollow Purple was good, but we have to talk about the ending because Gege is pretty stupid when it comes to this. And also he does actually ruin a lot of aspects of this manga. So all the issues I've talked about so far within this fight, they really do culminate in one of the worst endings to a fight I've ever seen. It's so bad that anyone who says it's good needs to be checked for brain damage. In this ending, Gege simultaneously kills Gojo's character and the plot. But what do I mean by that? So Gojo dying was an expected outcome, at least to me, because if Sukuna dies, the story is dead, as Kenjaku is not a threat, really. He can get killed by Gojo. But with Sukuna winning and Gojo dying, then the heroes lose. So I was like, okay, the story's over regardless. Because again, the studio characters that are alive cannot compete with Sukuna. They have not had the time to train. The power gap is so insane. And so basically, it ends up having where you end up thinking of, like, not how can Yuji win, because you're like, oh, Yuji isn't even close to Sukuna. You're thinking, how is Gege going to make the heroes win? Because they can't compete. But I don't want to talk about that for now. Moving on to Gojo's character, this is where Gege completely destroys him. This happens on chapter 236, where we have the train scene. We have Gojo speaking to Geto and talking about how strong Sukuna is and so forth, but then Gojo says something really stupid. He says that Sukuna would have won without the 10 shadows technique. This is an absolute lie. It's foolish. As I previously mentioned, in chapter, I think 224, or not 224, 230, I'm saying it wrong probably. After when Maharaga breaks the domain of Gojo, if Maharaga was not there, Gojo wins. This is not even a debate. How is Sukuna gonna break the domain? How? It's just stupid. How is he gonna get past infinity? Don't know. It's just dumb. It's really stupid. The only time in this fight where Sukuna is clearly winning is the domain expansion section, which I thought was handled really well, outside of the constant cuts to characters watching and providing long explanations of things that should have been already established. That's aside to the point. Outside of that domain battle, though, Gojo was always putting the beat down on Sukuna. Maharaga was the one saving Sukuna from Gojo's techniques like red, blue, again, even purple, and even the domain. So it's ridiculous for Gojo to say that Sukuna would have beaten him even if he didn't have Megumi's 10 shadows. It's stupid. Even saying Sukuna didn't even go all out. That's a dumb statement. That's dumb. That is dumb. It's even worse because Gojo would never say this. As someone as arrogant and prideful as he is, truly, when it comes to fighting and strength, there's no way he would say this. There's no way to say this. It gets even worse in the story when we go on, for Gojo starts talking about trying to understand Sukuna's solitude. Gojo says, I can emphasize with the magnitude of his sheer solitude more than anyone else. I love everyone and don't feel lonely now, but somewhere along the line there was a line I drew, not as a human but as a living creature. You can make a flower bloom, you can admire it, but you can't tell that flower, I want you to understand me. The skills I drilled into this body of mine, my refined senses, even my haphazard and tactics and explosive power, I gave it my all. I wanted to convey everything to Sukuna. I wanted him to know. This is so bad because when you take into everything account of the story of Gojo's characterization, why would he say this? What reason would he have to say this? It's foolish. It doesn't make any sense because the characters don't even have an interaction. They don't have a history. It's dumb. If Gege wanted to have this scene make sense, he needed Gojo and Sukuna to interact more. It, it doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. It's even worse because Gojo further states once again, he states that Sukuna wasn't able to give it his all, which is false and creates a dissidence between the reader, what the reader is seeing versus what Gege is trying to tell, because Gege is a bad writer. And then Gojo apologizes for that. My brain is melting at this because Gege just does not know how to write. It is another example of Gege showing something that is in conflict, or Gege telling something that is in conflict with what he showed. There is no reason for the statement to be true, and there is no reason for Gojo to talk about Sukuna like this. It's dumb. Even worse when Gojo is exposed by Nanami, then I kind of realized here, I'm like, oh wait, does Gege just doesn't have an understanding of this character whatsoever? It's like Gege saw how popular Gojo was and realized, oh wait, this character's too popular. He's too likable. I have to destroy his character to get what I want. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's a genuinely awful sequence of events and deserves no praise. It shows an author who fundamentally does not understand their characters and does not know how to write satisfying character deaths or conclusions. I don't care if it's realistic. I don't care if it's good. In the subjective opinion, it is awful writing, awful character execution, and awful plot. And I briefly want to talk about the explanation given by Gege in chapter 236 of why Sukuna was able to do the slash. Although he doesn't show how Sukuna shot the slash, he gives an explanation of why. And reading this and knowing anything about calculus, you kind of realize like Gege's explanation makes no sense, especially given the state of how Sukuna was in chapter 2 at the end of chapter 235. Again, Sukuna is completely destroyed. His left arm is destroyed. His foot is destroyed. His body is completely scorched. You see the destruction. It's everything is over. Maharaga is destroyed, and even characters like Kusakabe says that Gojo has regaining output for recurse technique thanks to Black Flash, while Sukuna can't heal rapidly. He lost Maharaga and has sustained enough damage that he can't even fight empty-handed with amplification. And then Yuji says, so that means Gojo won. Again, there's no way, there's nothing at all to indicate that this character is about to get hit by an attack. Gege later stated in some interview that Gojo was caught off guard. My only response to that is how. It doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. This really makes the character feel like they missed a chapter of wow, this attack actually happened. The transition is very jarring and abrupt, which people say, oh, it's good, but honestly, it comes out very hollow and cheap. But let me move back on to the explanation I want to give regarding the holes in Gege's mathematical principles. So Sukuna goes on this very long tangent about how he used Maharaga to cut through existence, through space and the world itself, and he did something stupid and talked about like, with regard to infinity, as long as it exists within space, that world, the existence will split apart. But he just goes on a really stupid tangent. This doesn't make any sense because Gojo's infinity is not a object. It does not exist in space. It is a metaphysical rule. For those who don't know, Gojo's infinity basically functions as a geometric series that is infinitely diverging. Think of an asymptote going to positive or negative infinity. The distance an attack must travel to hit him is modeled by an infinite sum. It never reaches Gojo because the process requires an infinite number of steps to complete, as indicated by the Achilles and the torches paradox by philosopher Zeno. This technique enforces the mathematical reality. It creates a divergent process of infinite steps that must be completed before the attack lands. So his infinity is not a thing or a force field located in space. It is a condition applied to Gojo. So Sukuna saying that he cut the world, cut existence that contains infinity, he bypasses, doesn't make sense because it assumes that infinity is an object within space. It's not an object, it's a law. Imagine you saw a road and there's a speed limit that's 20 miles per hour. Sukuna's solution in this would be to cut the road itself to bypass the speed limit, but the speed limit is not in the asphalt, it's a law being applied to the road. Destroying the road doesn't negate the law, it just destroys the domain where the law applies. It's pointless if your target is on the road. You cannot cut a mathematical condition or a physical law. You can cut an object governed by law, but the law itself is abstract. Infinity is the law, not an object in the world. If Sukuna actually cut space, coordinate space, the XYZ plane or the three-dimensional space, he would be warping or destroying the medium his slash must travel. Thus, the attack wouldn't really land because it would disrupt any attack, as it would not selectively negate a rule within that space. It's like destroying that speed limit. You can destroy the road, but the speed limit still exists. The rule is still intact. It's just stupid. Gege wants to sound cool and philosophical. You know, it's like, oh, I didn't cut you, I cut your existence in the world. But he's confusing a spatial property with a metaphysical rule. It doesn't make any sense. And this is the issue with this manga. You have cool sounding systems over consistent logical rules. All you should have said is that Gojo's infinity had burnt out after using hollow purple, and that's why Sukuna was able to kill him. That's all you had to say. Don't try to get mathematical. Don't try to implement cool sounding stuff, because all you do is make yourself sound like an idiot. I briefly want to talk about why the issue this fight was so hyped up. I think the issue is that it was created in a modern age where you had a lot of influence from media. Because the way people consume media is very different from how they did, you know, in like the early 2000s, like 2006 or something, 2007, 2008. It's very different. I remember a time where you would have to sit down and watch TV like Cartoon Network or like Toonami or on Adult Swim late at night to watch anime, or you have to go on a pirate site like Naruto Get or Bleach Get to watch anime. So it was really different. The genre was pretty niche and reserved for those who were born in like the 80s or 90s who kind of grew up when it was getting big, and at least in America. You know, and even on YouTube, it wasn't really big. There's a couple people I remember watching who were like, you know, the biggest anime creators at the time. And that was like Forever World, you know, Double for Anime before he lost his mind, Mastar, or even Tekken 101 for Bleach. Very different. I remember there being a lot more character analysis, a lot more, you know, people interested in a character because they found them interesting rather than being cool. And it seems like things are just focused on hype or that appeal to the most basic senses, that drive and elicits an emotional response that will captivate audiences. I think this manga or this anime was subject to that because it released in the perfect storm of rapid fanism, where people started to make things they like a part of their actual self. And so where if that piece of media was bad, then they felt like their lives were bad. But that's besides the point. People may say that I am a Gojo glazer, which I disagree. I don't think Gojo is a really good character. I think he could have been a good character. I think Sukuna's an awful character. I think Gege's an awful writer. But I just wanted to show why this manga fails its characters. And I also wanted to give a serious critique of Gojo versus Sukuna, because many people claim that this is the best fight in all of Shonen, and I don't agree. I will concede that this fight is the most hype, but it truly is the most disappointing one in this modern era. Full of potential, but it flew too close to the sun and burnt its wings before plummeting into the ocean. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and take care.